How would you feel if your own mother looked at you at 13 years old and said, "You're not pretty, but some men like them young and scared. We could make good money off you." That was the night Elara Thorne learned what it felt like to be worth something. Not as a daughter, as merchandise. Her mother had already picked out the websites, already contacted the clients, already decided that selling her daughter's body was easier than getting clean. 3 days later, a letter arrived. A scholarship to a school Elara had never heard of. No explanation, no application, just an escape. She took it. She would have gone anywhere to survive. She didn't know she was being sent to a school full of vampires. She didn't know she was the only human. And she definitely didn't know that 2 vampire princes who'd been alive for 800 years would step out of the shadows of a library one night and say the words that would change everything. "We've been searching centuries for you." Before we dive into this story, hit that subscribe button if you're ready for vampire fiction that doesn't hold back. And drop a comment telling me which country you're watching from. I want to know where my clan is tuning in from. Because what you're about to hear isn't a fairy tale, it's a survival story wrapped in fangs and destiny. So get comfortable. This one's going to stay with you. Elara's first memory was cigarette smoke mixed with cheap vanilla perfume, and the sound of her mother's heels clicking against linoleum at 3 in the morning. She was 4 years old, curled up on unwashed laundry in the corner of their studio apartment, trying to make herself small enough to disappear. "Don't you look at me like that," Marissa had slurred, mascara streaked down her face. "You think I wanted this? You think I asked for you?" Elara learned early that speaking made things worse, that invisibility was survival, that some children raise themselves because no one else will. By age 7, she knew things children shouldn't know. She knew the white powder in plastic bags made her mother's eyes go glassy. She knew when Marissa put on red lipstick and the shortest skirt, she'd be gone all night at the Velvet Rose, the club downtown where bruises came home with her and emptiness never left. She knew the men who stumbled through their door at dawn weren't there to help. By 10, Elara was forging signatures on school forms, stealing food when cupboards stayed empty for days, doing homework by a neighbor's window light when their electricity died again. She learned to dodge landlords and lie to teachers with just enough normalcy to avoid questions that led to foster care, which everyone said was worse. She was plain, unremarkable, mousy brown hair that never held shape, gray-green eyes that weren't quite either color, a body all sharp angles from too many skipped meals. At school, she was invisible by design. No friends meant no questions about why she wore the same 3 outfits, why she flinched at unexpected touch, why she sometimes fell asleep at her desk. The other girls had sleepovers and birthday parties and mothers who packed lunches with notes inside. Elara had bruises under long sleeves and a bone-deep understanding that she was fundamentally alone. When she turned 13, Marissa started bringing home catalogs. Not the retail kind, the other kind. Photographs of young girls in poses that made Elara's stomach turn, prices listed beneath them like they were products. "You're getting older," Marissa had said, studying her with calculating eyes usually reserved for potential clients. "Not pretty, but some men like that, like them young and scared, could make good money off you." Elara had locked herself in the bathroom and vomited until nothing was left. She was 13 with no money, no family, no safe place to run. The system wouldn't help. She'd heard the stories from other kids whose situations sometimes got worse, not better. Running away meant streets and different predators and a slower kind of death. She'd prayed that night for the first time since she was small enough to believe in mercy. Prayed for a way out, for someone to see her, for anything to change. The letter arrived 3 days later on heavy cream paper that looked expensive, addressed to Elara Thorne specifically. Return address, Thornhaven Academy of Excellence. Marissa had opened it, too strung out to fully comprehend. Some scholarship thing. For gifted students or whatever. She'd laughed, bitter and sharp. Must have gotten mixed up with that escort service form I filled out. Elite Companions, Excellence Academy. All sounds the same at 3 a.m. The letter said Elara had been accepted. that all expenses were covered. That term began September 1st. That transportation would be arranged. There was no explanation of how they knew about her, no details about what made her gifted, just an address in the mountains and a date 3 weeks away. Marissa signed the acceptance form without reading it, too relieved at one less mouth to feed to ask questions. Elara didn't ask questions either. Anywhere was better than here. Anything was better than what her mother had planned. The car that picked her up was black and sleek. The driver wore a suit and didn't speak, but his eyes kept finding hers in the rearview mirror with something that looked like pity. They drove for hours, city to suburbs to empty mountain roads shrouded in mist. Thornhaven Academy sat at the top of a mountain like a nightmare made stone. Towers and iron gates, stained glass that gleamed red in afternoon light. Grounds so vast she couldn't see where they ended. The other students looked like they'd stepped from magazine pages, beautiful, polished, moving through halls in groups, speaking about places Elara had never heard of, wearing uniforms that probably cost more than everything she'd ever owned. She'd been given a room in the North Tower, larger than her entire apartment. A uniform waited on the bed with supplies and books and a welcome packet that explained nothing. It wasn't until that first evening in the dining hall that she noticed how the students moved. Too fast, too fluid, too perfect. It wasn't until she saw the girl in the corner booth casually display fangs while laughing that Elara understood. Vampire Academy, and she was human. The whispers started immediately. How did a human get in? Must be a mistake. Maybe she's food. Blood bag on reserve. The bullying started small. Books knocked from her hands. Chairs pulled out. Cruel laughter when she didn't understand references to their world, their history, their hierarchy. Then it escalated. Shoves in empty hallways. Threats whispered in darkness. One girl, Saraphene, a vampire princess with platinum hair and ice chip eyes, cornered her in the bathroom with a blade against her throat. "You don't belong here, human," Saraphene had hissed. "You're an insult, a mistake that needs correcting." Elara survived by becoming invisible again, learning when halls were empty, which routes avoided the worst tormentors, being so unremarkable that even bullies grew bored. 2 months of hell, 2 months of surviving in a place where she was prey surrounded by predators. 2 months of wondering who sent that letter and why they wanted her here and why no one had killed her yet. If you grew up believing you were nothing, would you trust anyone who suddenly said you weren't? The library became Elara's sanctuary after dark. When the halls emptied and the other students retreated to their dorms, she claimed the corner table in the restricted history section. Surrounded by books about creatures that shouldn't exist, she felt almost safe, almost invisible again. She was researching vampire bloodline hierarchies for an essay she'd probably fail anyway. How could a human possibly understand the complexities of immortal court politics? When the air in the library changed, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, all at once like winter had walked through the door. Her breath misted in front of her face. Every instinct she'd honed from 13 years of survival screamed, "Predator." She looked up. 2 figures stood between the towering bookshelves, backlit by moonlight streaming through stained glass windows. They hadn't walked there. They'd simply appeared, as if the shadows had given birth to them. The first was darkness made flesh, black hair that caught no light, wine-red eyes that gleamed like blood and crystal. He wore the crimson and black uniform that marked vampire royalty, silver pins at his collar designating him as one of the princes. Every line of his body was controlled, contained, like he'd spent centuries learning not to move unless he chose to. The second was his opposite. Golden hair that fell to his shoulders, amber eyes that burned like embers in a dying fire. His smile was all sharp edges and dangerous promises. He moved like water, circling her slowly, studying her the way a predator studies prey before deciding whether to play with it or devour it. Both of them radiated power that made her bones ache. "You're the human," the Dark One said. His voice was low, measured, each word carefully chosen, as if he'd been speaking for so long that careless language was beneath him. "The one who shouldn't exist," the Golden One added. He was closer now, close enough that she could feel the unnatural cold radiating from him. Close enough to smell something rich and ancient on his skin, old leather and winter nights and something darker she couldn't name. Elara's hands clenched on her book. Her mind was already calculating distance to the door, whether she could outrun them, whether running would trigger their hunting instincts. She'd survived this long by knowing when to disappear. She pushed her chair back, stood, took one step toward the exit. The golden one moved. 1 second he was 3 feet away. The next he was in front of her, blocking her path. He hadn't run. Hadn't even seemed to move quickly. He'd just been there, suddenly, impossibly. Up close, he was devastating. All sharp cheekbones and full lips and eyes that held centuries of knowledge she couldn't begin to fathom. He tilted his head, studying her face like she was a text he was trying to translate. "Don't run," he said softly. "We've been watching you for weeks, trying to understand, trying to figure out why you were brought here," the Dark One continued. He'd moved too, though she hadn't heard him. Now he stood to her right, close enough that she was flanked between them, surrounded. Why you, of all the humans in the world, were chosen for Thornhaven. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. Could they hear it? The book said vampires could hear heartbeats from rooms away, could smell fear and arousal and every emotion the body betrayed. "I'll leave," she said, hating how her voice shook. "I know I don't belong here. I'll just don't." The Dark Prince's voice carried command that made her freeze. Not compulsion, something deeper. Something that bypassed her mind and went straight to her instincts. "We've been watching you, the way you move through these halls like you're trying not to be seen, the way you survive in a place designed to destroy you, the way you refuse to break." "Do you know what you look like to us?" the Golden One asked. He was close enough now that she could feel his breath against her ear. Cold, no heartbeat in his chest. "You're mortal, fragile. Your heart beats so fast I can hear it singing. Your blood runs warm beneath skin so thin I could tear through it with barely any effort." His fingers brushed her wrist. The touch was ice against her pulse point. "You should be terrified," he whispered. "You should be running. But you're not. You've been surrounded by predators for 2 months and you're still here. Still fighting. Still refusing to disappear. Why?" the Dark Prince asked. He'd moved closer too. Now she was truly trapped between them, her back nearly against the table, both of them towering over her with eyes that reflected the moonlight like animals. "What makes a human girl survive in a place like this?" "I'm nobody," Elara said, the truth she'd carried her whole life. "I'm nothing. My own mother said so." Something flashed in the Dark Prince's eyes. Anger, old and cold and carefully controlled. "Your mother," he said slowly, "was wrong." The Golden Prince reached up, brushing a strand of mousy brown hair away from her face. His fingers lingered against her cheek, ice against fire, death touching life. "You weren't chosen despite being human, Elara Thorn," he said. "You were chosen because of what you are." "We've been alive for 800 years, the Dark Prince continued. His voice dropped lower, intimate, like he was sharing a secret meant only for her. "We've seen empires rise and fall. We've watched centuries pass like heartbeats. And in all that time we've been searching." "Be for what?" Elara whispered. The Golden Prince smiled. "It was beautiful and terrible and full of promises she didn't understand for you." The Dark Prince's hand came up to cup her jaw. His touch was gentle despite the strength she could feel coiled beneath his skin. Strength that could break her without effort. Strength that was choosing not to. "You're not nothing, Elara Thorn," he said, his wine-red eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her catch. "You're ours." The word hung in the air between them. Ours. Possessive. Absolute. Dangerous. 2 vampire princes who could have anyone. Who'd lived for centuries. Who radiated power and death and ancient beauty. And they were looking at her. Plain, invisible. Broken Elara. Like she was something precious they'd been denied for far too long. Her body didn't know whether to run or lean closer. Her mind screamed danger. But for the first time since she was 4 years old and small enough to believe in mercy, someone was looking at her like she mattered. Like she was worth searching for, like she was worth keeping. The blood moon ceremony happened once every decade, a night when ancient vampire courts gathered to honor bloodlines, reaffirm power, and remind the world why their kind had ruled from the shadows for millennia. Attendance was mandatory, even for humans who shouldn't exist. The grand hall had been transformed. Crimson banners hung from vaulted ceilings. Candles burned with flames that cast everything in shades of blood and shadow. At the center, a raised platform held a silver chalice older than most countries, used for blood oaths that bound families and sealed alliances. Hundreds of vampires filled the space, not just students, ancient lords and ladies who moved with the weight of centuries, faces carved from marble, eyes that held the deaths of empires. They wore silks and jewels, and expressions of cold superiority that made Elara's survival instinct scream. She stood near the back, trying to be invisible again, trying to ignore the way every vampire in the room could sense her humanity, could smell her blood, could hear her racing heart like a dinner bell. Kaelin and Dorian stood at the front with the other royalty, both in formal crimson and black, both looking like they'd been carved from the same darkness that created the first vampires. They hadn't spoken to her since Dorian's public declaration at breakfast 3 days ago. Kaelin's strategy of distance, of keeping her safe by keeping away, but their eyes found her constantly, tracking her through the crowd, making sure she was still breathing. The ceremony began with blood oaths. Ancient families stepping forward to reaffirm their lineage, each house more powerful than the last, each bloodline more pure. That's when Saraphene made her move. She stepped onto the platform in a gown of ice-white silk that made her look like death in beautiful form. Her platinum hair cascaded down her back. Her eyes, chips of frozen cruelty, swept the crowd before landing on Elara. "I call challenge," Saraphene announced. Her voice carried through the hall with the authority of someone born to rule. "There is an abomination among us. A human who defiles this sacred gathering with her presence." The crowd shifted. Murmurs rippled through hundreds of vampires. Eyes turned to find Elara in the back. "She doesn't belong here," Saraphene continued. "She pollutes our academy, insults our bloodlines. She is nothing but a blood bag pretending to be a student, and I demand she be removed, dealt with, before her existence becomes a stain we cannot wash away." Agreement murmured through the crowd. Ancient vampires nodding. This was the natural order. Humans were prey, nothing more. Elara's hands clenched at her sides. 13 years of worthlessness came flooding back. Every cruel word her mother had ever said. Every moment she'd spent trying to be small enough to avoid notice. She'd been a fool to think she could be anything else. The crowd parted. Kaelin and Dorian moved through the vampires like dark water, side by side, united, their faces carved from rage and decision. They stepped onto the platform, flanking Saraphene, towering over her despite her aristocratic bearing. "The human," Kaelin said, his voice carrying command that made even the ancient vampires fall silent, "has a name. Elara Thorn. And she's under our protection." "Protection?" Saraphene laughed, sharp and mocking. "You protect cattle now, Your Highness? How far the royal bloodlines have fallen." "Careful," Dorian said softly, dangerously. "You're close to declaring war on our house. Is your pride worth that?" "This isn't about pride," Saraphene shot back. "It's about law. About order. Humans don't belong in our world, and they certainly don't belong bonded to vampire royalty." "Then we'll change the law," Kaelin said. The hall erupted. Outrage, shock. Ancient vampires who'd lived by the same rules for centuries now faced with princes willing to shatter everything. "You would break ancient law?" An older vampire stepped forward. Lady Morgana, head of one of the oldest bloodlines. Her face was beautiful and terrible, untouched by time. "You would disgrace your family for one mortal girl?" "Yes," both princes said simultaneously. Dorian turned to face the crowd. "We've been searching for 800 years. We found her. And we will not let her go." Not for your laws, not for your politics, not for anything. Then you leave us no choice, Lady Morgana said coldly. The courts will demand an explanation, your families will disown you, and the girl will still die. Because that's what happens to humans who reach above their station. She's not reaching, Kaelin said. We're claiming her. There's a difference. He moved, faster than Elara could track. One moment he was on the platform, the next he was in front of her, his hand extended. Come here, he said quietly. Trust us. Elara's mind screamed at her to run, but her feet moved forward, through the crowd of vampires that parted like she carried plague, up the steps to the platform where Dorian waited with eyes that burned like embers. This is going to hurt, Dorian said, and we're sorry, but it's the only way to keep you alive. What? Elara started. Kaelin's hand cupped her jaw, tilted her head to expose her throat. A blood bond, he said, not a turning, a mark. It ties your life to ours, means anyone who harms you declares war on our bloodline. It also means you'll never be fully human again. You're giving me a choice? Elara whispered. No, Dorian said honestly. We're out of time for choices. We're doing what we have to do to protect you. Hate us for it later if you want. Kaelin's eyes met hers, wine-red and ancient and full of regret. This will change everything. Forgive us. He struck. Fangs pierced her throat, ice and fire and agony that made her scream. But Dorian was behind her, holding her upright, his hand over her heart as Kaelin drank. Not much, just enough to tie her life force to theirs. Enough to mark her as claimed. Enough to make retreat impossible. When Kaelin pulled back, his lips stained red with her blood, Dorian turned her and struck on the other side of her throat. 2 marks, 2 bonds, 2 princes claiming her in front of hundreds of witnesses. The hall exploded in outrage, ancient vampires shouting, families demanding explanation, laws being shattered in real time. But Elara barely heard it, because something inside her was cracking open, something that had been sleeping her entire life. She could feel them now. Kaelin's controlled fury, Dorian's fierce possessiveness, could sense the bloodlust of every vampire in the room, could feel ancient power thrumming beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. The bite burned like ice and fire, and deep inside, something stirred, something that recognized the princes, something that had been waiting to wake up. They'd claimed her, but they'd also awakened something they didn't understand. If you're still watching, you already know. This isn't a love story. This is a reckoning. The first thing Elara noticed was the sounds. Not just louder, different. She could hear conversations 3 floors away, could hear heartbeats that didn't exist because vampires didn't have them, could hear the whisper of silk against stone as someone moved through a corridor she couldn't even see. The second thing was the emotions. She'd wake up drowning in feelings that weren't hers. Kaelin's controlled rage at the vampire courts. Dorian's fierce protectiveness mixed with guilt for marking her without true consent. Every vampire who passed her in the halls became a symphony of bloodlust and ambition and ancient hungers she didn't have words for. The blood bond had changed her. She wasn't human anymore, not fully. But she wasn't vampire either. She was something caught in between. Something the old texts didn't have a name for. You need to learn to fight, Kaelin said one night in the training rooms beneath the academy. Secret lessons that happened after midnight when the other students slept. The bond protects you politically. But there will always be vampires willing to risk war to eliminate a threat. He moved like liquid death, teaching her not vampire strength. She'd never have that, but vampire strategy. How to read an opponent's intention before they struck. How to use their overconfidence against them. How to survive when you're the weakest thing in the room. You're not prey anymore, he told her, circling her with those wine-red eyes tracking every movement. You're something they don't understand, that makes you dangerous. Use it. The academy divided almost immediately. Some students, particularly the younger ones, the ones not yet poisoned by centuries of hierarchy, accepted the prince's claim, treated Elara with wary respect, gave her space in the halls. Others, led by Saraphene's faction, saw her as an insult that needed correction, a stain on vampire purity. a problem to be solved. The assassination attempt started small. Poison in her food that her new enhanced senses could smell before it touched her lips. A loose stone in the North Tower stairwell positioned to send her tumbling to her death. An older student who cornered her in the library with a blade and a smile. Dorian had found that one. Had lifted the vampire by his throat and held him against the wall with enough force to crack stone. "Spread the word," Dorian had said, his voice ice and fury. "Touch her, and I'll make your death last weeks. Test me." But the attacks kept coming, because some things were worth dying for, and keeping vampire bloodlines pure was one of them. 3 weeks after the blood moon ceremony, Kaelin's mother arrived. Queen Isadora was ancient in ways that made the other vampires look like children. She'd been alive when Rome fell, had seen the birth of nations and the death of empires. Her beauty was cold and perfect, untouched by millennia. Her eyes held the weight of ages. She looked at Elara like she was examining a disease. "This is what you've risked everything for?" she asked Kaelin in the private meeting room, where she'd summoned both princes and their marked human. "This plain mortal girl?" "Yes," Kaelin said simply. "Then you're a fool." Isadora's gaze cut to Elara. "Do you understand what you've done? The political chaos you've created? The ancient families calling for blood because my son marked prey?" "I didn't ask for this," Elara said quietly. "No, you're simply the pawn they chose to play." Isadora turned back to her son. "Break the bond, or turn her fully. Those are your options." "Turning could kill her," Dorian said. "Humans don't always survive." "Then she dies," Isadora said coldly. "Better that than this half-state that insults everything we are." Elara felt Kaelin's controlled fury through the bond, felt Dorian's barely restrained violence, felt the weight of centuries-old power structures crushing down on the three of them. She'd spent her life being used by her mother, sold and bargained and treated like merchandise. Was she being used again? Just in a prettier cage? That night she went to the restricted section of the library, the place where the oldest texts were kept, the histories that vampire, nobility didn't want examined too closely. She searched for hours, through texts written in languages she shouldn't be able to read but somehow could, through prophecies and bloodline records and forgotten lore. That's when she found it, seer-born. An ancient bloodline believed extinct for over 1,000 years. Humans with latent vampire ancestry, born with the ability to see past and future, to witness truths that others couldn't perceive, to expose secrets that powerful vampires had spent centuries burying. The old courts had hunted them to extinction, too dangerous, too threatening to the established order. The prophecy was written in script so old it crumbled at her touch. When the seer-born awakens, the old courts will fall, and a new age will begin. Elara's hands shook as she read. This was what she was. This was why she'd been sent to Thornhaven, why the princes had been searching, why she was a threat worth killing. The vision started that same night, flashes of past atrocities, vampires slaughtering seer-born children in their beds, courts ordering executions to maintain power, centuries of bloodshed to keep one truth buried, that the vampire hierarchy was built on fear of those who could see through their lies, and future visions, fragmented, incomplete, but devastating. She saw Saraphene standing over her body, saw ancient vampire courts in flames, saw Kaelin and Dorian forced to choose between her and their families, saw her own death in a dozen different ways. She saw the princes 800 years ago, younger, holding a woman who looked nothing like Elara but somehow felt familiar, watching her die because they'd been too late, too weak, too bound by laws they should have broken. Had they known, from the beginning? Had they recognized what she was and claimed her anyway? Was this about protecting her or controlling the prophecy, about love or about power? She found them in Kaelin's chambers, both of them waiting like they'd known she'd discover the truth tonight. "You knew," Elara said. "Not a question. You knew what I was." "We suspected," Kaelin admitted. "The markers fit, the bloodline signature. But we couldn't be certain until you marked me and awakened it. Elara finished. You used me, just like everyone else in my life. No, Dorian said fiercely. We protected you. Do you understand what would happen if the courts discovered what you are? They'd kill you before you could fully awaken. Before I could see the truth? Elara interrupted. Before I could expose 800 years of vampire corruption? Before I could become the threat the prophecy promised? Silence fell between them. We found you because we've been searching for her, Kaelin said quietly. The woman we lost. The seer-born the courts murdered because we were too afraid to break the laws that kept us in power. We've spent 8 centuries regretting our cowardice. When we felt your signature, we knew we had a second chance. To do it right this time, or to control the prophecy before it controls you, Elara said. The princes said she was theirs. But what if she was never meant to belong to anyone? The spring equinox gala was supposed to be a celebration. 300 years of Thornhaven Academy. Vampire nobility from across the world gathered in the grand hall. Music and blood wine and speeches about tradition and power. Elara should have seen it coming, should have recognized the way Saraphene smiled when their eyes met across the crowded room, the way certain nobles positioned themselves near exits, the way the air tasted like violence waiting to happen. But her visions had been fragmented lately, incomplete, like trying to see through shattered glass. The attack came during the toast. Saraphene raised her crystal glass, and in that moment, everything changed. The lights died, screams erupted, and 6 rogue vampires, ancient ones, the kind who'd lived long enough to stop caring about consequences, materialized around Elara like a noose tightening. Kaelin and Dorian moved instantly. But they were across the room, and vampires were fast, and 6 against 2 meant someone was going to die tonight. The court send their regards, one of the rogues said. His fangs gleamed in the darkness. Nothing personal, seer-born. You're just too dangerous to let live. Elara ran, not away from them. She'd learned enough from Kaelin to know that running from predators triggered their hunting instincts. She ran toward the restricted library wing, toward the oldest texts, toward knowledge that might save her if combat couldn't. They cornered her in the archives, 6 vampires who'd killed for centuries, who moved like death choreographed, who looked at her like she was already a corpse. Behind them, she heard Kaelin and Dorian fighting, heard bodies slamming into stone, heard Dorian's roar of fury when more rogues blocked their path. The princes were strong, but they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered. This was it. The moment Elara had been running from her entire life. The moment when being weak and human and powerless finally caught up to her. Any last words? Saraphene stepped through the circle of rogues. She'd orchestrated this, funded it, convinced old vampire nobility that killing one girl was worth the risk of war. I want you to know, this isn't just about bloodline purity, it's about keeping the natural order. Prey doesn't become predator, the weak don't become powerful, and humans certainly don't threaten centuries of vampire rule. Elara's back hit the bookshelf. Nowhere left to run, just like when she was 13 and her mother decided she was worth more dead than alive, just like every moment of her life when she'd been powerless to stop what was coming. Except this time, something inside her refused to break. This time, something ancient and sleeping and buried in her bloodline cracked open like an egg hatching. The world exploded into vision, not one future. Thousands, branching and overlapping and cascading like water. Every possible outcome, every choice, every consequence. She saw Saraphene's attack before she moved, saw the rogue vampire on her left planning to strike high while the one on her right went low. Saw the blade hidden in the third vampire's sleeve. Saw the poison coating it. Saw her own death in 47 different ways. But she also saw the truth, 800 years of it. Slamming into her consciousness like a tidal wave, she saw them. Kaelin and Dorian, younger, standing in a stone chamber while a woman with dark hair and eyes like storm clouds died in their arms. The woman was seer-born, the last of her bloodline before Elara, and she'd been murdered by the old courts because she'd seen too much, knew too much, threatened too much. The princes had loved her. had been too afraid to break the laws that might have saved her, had chosen duty over devotion, had watched her die because they weren't strong enough to rewrite the ending. They'd spent 8 centuries searching for her soul, waiting for reincarnation, hoping the universe would give them another chance. Elara was that chance. Same soul, same power, different face and name and life story. But the same essence the princes had lost. They'd been searching for centuries, not for a human, for her. And this time they'd chosen differently, had claimed her publicly, had shattered ancient laws, had risked everything to rewrite the ending they'd failed to change 800 years ago. The prophecy crystallized in her mind. The seer-born doesn't just see the future, she changes it, by exposing truth, by refusing to let corruption hide in shadows, by being the thing powerful vampires feared most, someone who could see them clearly. Elara opened her eyes. The rogues attacked, and she saw everything. "Lord Vane," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You funded this assassination because I saw what you did to your brother, how you poisoned him to inherit his territory. You're afraid I'll expose you." The rogue vampire froze. Shock flashed across his face. "Lady Cassandra," Elara continued, her gaze finding the elegant vampire in the corner. "You want me dead, because I know about the human trafficking network you run, the children you sell, the lives you destroy for profit." Gasps rippled through the crowd that had gathered, and Saraphene Elara turned to face the vampire princess. "You orchestrated this because you see the future too, not like I do, but enough to know that if I live, your family's corruption gets exposed. The bribes, the murders, the centuries of atrocities you've committed while hiding behind nobility." "She's lying," Saraphene screamed. "Am I?" Elara's eyes met hers. "Should I tell them about the servant girl you killed last month? The one who saw you meeting with rebel factions? The one whose body you burned and blamed on an accident?" Silence fell like a blade. The rogues hesitated, because truth was a weapon sharper than fangs, and Elara had just armed the entire room with it. Kaelin and Dorian broke through, blood on their clothes, fury in their eyes. They stood on either side of Elara, a united front. "You wanted to know why we've been searching for centuries?" Kaelin said to the assembled vampires. "This is why. Because she sees what we've become, what we've hidden, what we've refused to face. And because we refuse to fail her again," Dorian added. 800 years ago we let fear control us. We chose duty over devotion. We watched her die because we were too weak to change the ending." "Not this time," Kaelin finished. "The old courts were forced to acknowledge what stood before them. Not prey, not property, not even just seer-born, power. The kind that couldn't be killed without consequence. The kind that exposed truth in a world built on lies. They'd been searching for centuries, and they'd finally found her. The trials lasted 3 weeks. The old courts convened. Testimonies were given, evidence presented. Elara stood before vampire nobility older than nations and spoke truth they'd spent centuries trying to bury. Lord Vane was stripped of his titles. Lady Cassandra's trafficking network was dismantled. Saraphene's family lost their seat on the High Council. Others fell too. Dozens of ancient vampires whose corruption Elara could see like rot beneath perfect skin. She spoke, and their carefully constructed lies collapsed. By the time the trials ended, the vampire world had changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough that the cracks in the old order couldn't be ignored anymore. Elara had become what she'd spent her entire life avoiding, visible, undeniable, a symbol. She hated it. "They're calling you the truth bringer," Dorian said one evening reading from correspondence that arrived daily. Letters from vampire courts across the world. Some grateful, some threatening, all acknowledging that she existed and couldn't be erased. The seer who shattered silence, the girl who changed everything. "I didn't want to change everything," Elara said quietly. "I just wanted to survive." "You did more than survive," Kaelin said. He sat across from her in the study they'd claimed as their own. A space where three people who shouldn't exist together had learned to build something that almost looked like family. You exposed truth the old court spent millennia hiding. That's not nothing. It's also not what I chose, Elara said. You marked me, awakened my power, made me a target I'll be for the rest of my life. However long that is. The cost hung between them. Unspoken but understood. Elara wasn't human anymore. The blood bond had changed her, extended her lifespan, given her abilities that separated her from the girl she'd been. She'd live longer than any human, maybe a century, maybe two, but not forever, not like them. She'd age while they remained unchanged, would die while they continued, would leave them the way their first seer-born had, only this time through time instead of murder. We know, Kaelin said softly. We've always known. This ending isn't perfect either, but it's ours, Dorian added, for however long we have. The Academy changed too, had to. The trials had exposed too much corruption for the old guard to maintain control. New leadership was installed, younger vampires who'd grown tired of ancient hierarchies built on fear. The rules changed. Humans with latent supernatural blood, those with abilities but not full vampire nature, were now allowed to attend, protected instead of hunted. Elara became the face of that change, the proof that something different was possible. She never wanted to be a symbol. Didn't ask to represent hope for those caught between worlds, but wanting and being were different things, and the letters kept coming. From half-vampires who'd hidden their entire lives, from humans with abilities they'd been afraid to acknowledge, from young vampires who saw her and thought maybe the old ways weren't the only ways. She read every letter, answered when she could, carried the weight of their hope like stones in her pockets. The princes changed too. Kaelin, who'd spent 800 years controlling every emotion, every reaction, every dangerous feeling, he learned to let himself feel again. Not perfectly. He still calculated, still strategized, still moved through the world with careful precision. But sometimes, late at night, he'd hold Elara and let himself be afraid of losing her again. Let himself be angry at the universe for giving them limited time. Let himself love her without restraint or apology. Dorian, who'd spent centuries being impulsive and possessive and treating love like ownership, he learned restraint, not perfectly. He still wanted to lock Elara away from every threat, still wanted to claim her so completely that nothing could ever take her from them, but he learned to ask instead of command, to protect without controlling, to love without consuming. They were still dangerous, still vampires, still capable of cruelty when threatened, still carried 800 years of violence and power and aristocratic entitlement. But they'd chosen her, had risked everything for her, had rewritten an ending they'd failed to change the first time, and this time she got to choose them back. Not because she was bound, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because these flawed, ancient, dangerous beings had looked at her, plain, broken, invisible Elara, and decided she was worth burning the world for. The truth, Elara learned, was never simple. She'd spent 13 years being told she was nothing, worthless, a mistake her mother regretted every day. Then she'd spent months being told she was everything, a prophecy, a power, a symbol that would change the vampire world forever. Both were lies, or both were true, or the truth was somewhere in the complicated middle. She was Elara, survivor of an abusive childhood and 2 months of Vampire Academy hell. Seer-born who could see past and future and present truth. Girl who'd been marked by princes and awakened into power she didn't fully understand. Symbol she never wanted to be. Target she'd be for life. She was all of it and none of it and something that didn't have a name yet. The library became her sanctuary again. But different now. She sat at the same table where the princes had first appeared, where they'd said words that changed everything. You're ours. Books surrounded her. Not vampire history this time. Records of the seer-born. Ancient texts about her bloodline. Information about what she was and what she could become. Kaelin sat to her right, reading correspondence from courts that now had to acknowledge her existence. Dorian sat to her left, sharpening a blade with the idle violence of someone who'd spent centuries killing threats before they fully formed. They weren't hiding anymore. Any of them. The princes had spent 800 years searching, had found her, had claimed her, had chosen to rewrite fate itself rather than watch her die again. And Elara, invisible girl who'd learned to survive by disappearing, was done running from her future. She was creating it instead, whatever that looked like, however long it lasted. Whatever cost came with being seen. This was never really about vampires, not at the core, not where it mattered. This was about a girl who was told she was worthless her entire life. By her mother, who looked at her at 13 and decided she was worth more as merchandise than as a daughter. By circumstances that taught her invisibility was the only way to survive. By a world that overlooked her so completely she learned to believe she deserved to be overlooked. This was about what happens when you survive not because you're strong, but because you refuse to disappear. Elara wasn't powerful when this story started. She wasn't special. She was plain and broken and so thoroughly convinced of her own worthlessness that when two vampire princes said she mattered, her first instinct was to assume they were lying. Because that's what 13 years of emotional abuse does. It teaches you that love is conditional, that attention means danger, that being wanted always comes with a price you can't afford to pay. Her mother was wrong. Survival isn't weakness. The fact that Elara made it to 13 without completely shattering, that she learned to forge signatures and steal food and do homework by borrowed light, that wasn't pathetic. That was strength of a kind most people never have to develop. Being broken doesn't mean you're beyond repair. It just means you've survived something that tried to destroy you. And sometimes the cracks are where the light gets in, where power awakens, where you discover that the girl everyone overlooked was actually the thing they should have been watching all along. The princes didn't save Elara. That's important to understand. They didn't rescue her from her life and fix her with their ancient power and supernatural abilities. They couldn't fix 13 years of trauma with a blood bond and pretty words. What they did was see her. Really see her. Not as prey or property or a problem to be solved, but as someone worth searching 800 years to find. Someone worth risking everything to protect. Someone worth rewriting fate itself to keep alive. And sometimes being seen is the most dangerous and powerful thing that can happen to someone who's spent their life invisible. Because being seen means you can't hide anymore. Can't make yourself small. Can't disappear when things get hard. Being seen means accountability and visibility and becoming a target for everyone who preferred you hidden. But it also means you matter. That your existence has weight. That you're not nothing, no matter how many times someone told you that you were. In vampire lore, the seer-born are hunted to extinction because they see truth. That's their power. Not fangs or speed or supernatural strength. Just clarity. The ability to look at someone and see past the masks they wear, past the lies they tell, past the carefully constructed facades that took centuries to build. Elara's power isn't violence. It's honesty. She sees people for what they are, the monsters and the wounded, and the ones pretending to be both. She sees the vampire nobility hiding corruption behind aristocratic bearing. She sees the princes carrying 800 years of guilt and love and desperate hope. She sees herself, not as nothing, but as someone still learning what she could become. And in a world built on secrets and hierarchies and ancient power structures designed to keep certain people in power and others in the shadows, truth is the most dangerous weapon you can wield. That's what this story is really about. It's about refusing to let the world define you. About surviving long enough to discover that maybe you were never the problem. That maybe the people who called you worthless were just afraid of what you'd become if you ever realized your worth. It's about the courage it takes to be seen when you've learned that invisibility equals safety. About choosing to live visibly even when it makes you a target. About deciding that being acknowledged, really acknowledged, is worth the risk of being hurt again. Elara will never be normal. She'll carry the scars of her childhood forever. She'll always flinch at certain tones of voice. Will always feel that instinct to make herself small when threatened. Will always know what it feels like to be looked at by your own mother and found wanting. But she'll also know what it feels like to be claimed by beings who've lived for centuries and still chose her. To have power that makes ancient vampires afraid. To be seen not as prey but as something they have no category for. She'll know that survival isn't the ceiling, it's the foundation. And sometimes the girl who everyone overlooked becomes the one who changes everything. If you're drawn to vampire stories that aren't just about romance or power, but about survival, identity, and what it means to be seen, subscribe to Paxi Alpha Stories. This is where we tell stories about the creatures we fear and the humans who refuse to break. Stories that linger long after the video ends. Stories about girls who were told they were nothing and decided to become something anyway. About monsters who learned that love means choosing someone even when it costs everything. About power that comes not from fangs or strength, but from refusing to be silent about the truth. Because the best monster stories, they're really about us. About the parts of ourselves we're afraid to acknowledge. About the people who hurt us and the ones who see us and the choice we make every day between disappearing and existing loudly enough to be heard. Elara chose to exist, and that choice changed the world. What will yours change?